This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. Come Carpentier joins me once again today. It's a perfect time to talk to Come. Come, as people who watch this program know, is a big, EU watcher, and of course, a watcher of his own home country, France. And lots of things are happening in France. The government has collapsed. Now there is a new prime minister, but Macron seems more embattled than ever before. What's really happening in France? And is it really true today in the EU, as some people have begun saying, that the most powerful, leader in the EU now is essentially Georgia Meloni? To discuss all of this is with me is Combe Carpentier. Combe, thanks very much.
Thank you. Have a good morning, Hindol.
Morning, Combe. Combe, Georgia Meloni, the tallest leader today in Europe from Italy, especially because France's troubles in Germany. What's really going on?
I think Meloni, apart from her personal qualities, benefits from the fact that she's probably the only Western European leader who is more in tune with the general feelings of the population. In other words, she is right wing, if you want to call her that way, but this is I would say, the usual denomination nowadays for people who are nationalistic, who want law and order, who want, as much as possible, a sound, productive industrial economy, and who distrust globalization and woke politics. So if you gather these qualities in one leader, he or she is likely to be far more popular and effective than the others who are basically trying to run behind some current trends, which have already shown to be deeply misleading and mistaken.
And this, of course, all of the things that you just said is playing out in France, Combe. We have discussed France a few times before on Global Order with you and with others. Essentially, Macron, the election results were very skewed, as it were. The election was called, many people say, just in order to save Macron, to keep out, certain parts of the body politic, of course, in France, and the right wingers, so to speak. And now that the government has collapsed, the new prime minister has come in. How long can this fast go on?
It's not clear because under the constitution, you cannot have another parliamentary election for a year. And the last election was held a few months ago. Meanwhile, what happens is that there is no majority, and Macron himself commands on the loyalty of only perhaps 20% of the parliament. And on the other hand, you have two opposite blocs which agree on certain things but disagree massively on others. On the one hand, you have the National Rally, which is now for the last several years technically the most, I would say, not powerful because they are go against the trends, but they are the largest party in France. And on the other hand, you have a leftist bloc, which is not united, but which has tried to increase its strength by willy-nilly gathering around Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is a populist far-left leader, and who has a party called Unsubmitted France or Unsubmissive France, which basically can be qualified as very pro-immigration, especially very pro-Muslim immigration, very anti-EU, or at least anti-capitalist EU, fairly anti-American, fairly anti-Israeli, and generally speaking, in favor of a neutral policy, which means out of NATO. The National Rally has some sort of common affinities. I mean, some affinities because they also are against the overpowering EU. The EU has become far too powerful and tyrannical in some ways. And they are also against NATO as the reference point for foreign policy, because everybody knows that if you are in EU and NATO, you lose all your strategic autonomy and even your independence.
Curious alliance that you just mentioned, Com, of course, is interesting. On one side, of course, is Marine Le Pen. Now, Marine Le Pen is really coming, in a sense, to a particular point in her career where either she becomes head of French government, or perhaps, in a sense, her career will begin to slowly decline. I wonder what you think about how many chances are left for her. And of course, her entire sort of combination now, in order to bring down this government with the left and indeed the far left. Now, this is a bit of a strange combination. This perhaps cannot last, but Marine Le Pen would be thinking that as the leader of the biggest political party, she should get one chance to govern. Do you think that's going to happen? And if it doesn't happen, where does she stand?
Actually, as you know, she has put at the head of her party a young man called Jordan Bardella, who is of Italian immigrant origin and who is fairly appealing to the youth. In fact, he's now seen as, relatively speaking, the more popular possible candidate for prime minister because he gets between 12 and 15% of favorable opinions, whereas the other contenders for the prime ministerial job are below 6 or 7%. So that shows that the National Rally, in a way, is trying to reinvent itself. The combination that Marine Le Pen is trying to work out is that Jordan Bardella could at some point become the prime minister. And then when the next presidential elections, she could become the president. There are several obstacles on that path, including the fact that she's been prosecuted by the EU for apparently abusing financial privileges by using some of her staff to campaign for her party instead of doing parliamentary work. But the irony of it is that the new prime minister who has just been appointed, Mr. Behu, is actually guilty of the same thing and has been tried and condemned, and his party has had to pay a fine for using the parliamentary staff for political operations. But you see, this is almost everybody's doing it because once you have staff and you are a member of the European Parliament, if you belong to a party, naturally your staff is going to be operating for your party at some point. And that can easily be punished. So in a sense, it's a sort of a sword of Damocles that the European Parliament is holding over political parties, particularly those parties which are not liked.
In a sense, where does this leave the left? The left tried very hard and, at the last moment, pushed hard to support Macron and keep Marine Le Pen out. But you're saying the wheels are turning against them.
Yes, because the left has a program which very few people believe in. It's not feasible and it's highly unpopular in the sense that it's one thing to get out of the EU, and it's not even clear that they want to be out of the EU because as part of that left bloc, you have the socialists who are very pro-EU. So let's put it this way, that left bloc is divided among themselves. And on the other hand, they also want to nationalize the economy pretty much. They want to have massive immigration in the belief that the more people from Africa, the better. I mean, they can't quite justify that. They are just trying to pander to a certain electorate. And naturally, they have this rather utopian neutral foreign policy, which, has some valid points. But by and large, it's very much against the establishment's views. And let's face it, democracy is a very relative concept. And as you know, democracy is always conditioned by socio-political arrangements. And in the case of Europe, nowadays, the EU basically decides who can become a head of state and who cannot. Because if that head of state turns out to be anti-EU, then it's simply not acceptable. And in that case, there are certain principles of what is called the European project, which are above democratic decisions, which means that if the people vote wrong, then they should vote again later. And we see that is exactly what happened in Romania, where the election was cancelled, postponed, because the leading candidate was seen as dangerous for the EU. And therefore, they decided he couldn't run. And now you have the case of Georgia, which is not in the EU, but which the EU would like to include. And the current president of Georgia, who is originally a French diplomat, who took Georgian citizenship because she was of Georgian origin, and she became the president. And now she refuses to leave her position, even though her term has expired, because she says that the new candidate who has been elected as president, who is considered pro-Russian, is not acceptable. So you see where now you have ideology that trumps democratic decisions. I mean, as they say, some decisions are far too important to be taken by the people.
Let's talk a little bit about the reinvention of Marine Le Pen and her party. This is a very interesting experiment, of course, which you explained about getting an immigrant in a sense, and putting them a young immigrant and putting them up front as a face of the party, especially for prime ministership. But in a sense, a youthful reinvention of that party has been tried before, isn't it, Com? I remember a few years ago there was a lot of buzz about Marion Le Pen. I think now she calls herself Marion Marshall, who was, flaunted even in America as the great bright hope of conservatism coming from, mainland Europe. She was young, she was good looking, she was well versed in academic, subjects and language, and she could argue, hold her point, and yet that sort of fizzled out.
I wouldn't say it fizzled out. I think it was premature. I think Marion Maréchal was a symbol to many people. But let's face it, she was still very young, and even now she's very young, immature, not very well prepared. So some of her positions were not particularly appealing because she turned out to be too far to the right, a bit too, not pragmatic enough. As a result, some people lost hope. And let's face it, anybody who has tried to take over the national rally or to create a parallel movement and weaken it from inside has failed. And this has been the case for the last 30 years. The national rally under the Le Pen family has remained pretty much a bloc, and it hasn't lost many of its traditional supporters in all these last 3 or 4 decades. On the contrary, it has added a lot of voters, particularly from the left, from the Communist Party, because the Communist Party has practically disappeared. And many of the former communist voters are now faithful, reliable voters of the National Rally. So that tells you this is a party which combines a nationalist agenda with very strong social policy. And by the way, that is why it voted the vote of no confidence. It joined the left in voting the vote of no confidence against the last government, simply because it felt that the reforms that were being proposed as part of the program of the government then were simply unacceptable for the poorer sections of society, because there was a very sharp slash in social expenditures, massive rise in taxes, and a number of measures which were mandated by the European Union, but which were very painful for the French electorate, particularly for the poorer classes, which, let's face it, are getting generally poorer and poorer. So as a result, the National Rally commands the allegiance of a lot of the former left, because the new left is woke and is not particularly concerned with economic issues. They are interested in LGBTs and immigrants and how to be cool. So that doesn't really appeal to the traditional working class. Whether or not it's working, now it's more of the unemployed class. But anyway, this is what has kept the National Rally strong, relatively strong. It has also made mistakes. Marine Le Pen is not the most charismatic leader, and she also has a lot of critics. There have been rivalries within the party, but by and large, the party has really rejuvenated itself a lot. And all the outliers, such as Marion Maréchal and others, such as, Zemmour and Sarah Knafo, all those people are part of what you might call the right-wing constellation, the new nationalist right-wing constellation in the European Parliament and even in the French Parliament. And so they may have their own rivalries and internal political divisions, but if the opportunity to come to power is, achieved, then they will obviously come together. They will have to support each other because they can't possibly stay out. So I don't think the situation is worse than it was, say, 5 years ago. I think, on the contrary, the prospects have improved for the National Rally. Let's face it, as they have improved for most nationalist parties all over Europe. beginning with Hungary and then Slovakia, Italy, we have just talked about it, what's happening in Denmark, in the Netherlands, in Germany, and you name it. Practically all countries are now seeing a swing to the right, and I think that is going to accelerate with the arrival of Trump to power, because very clearly Trump will support these parties to some extent. And we know he's already sort of canvassing for the dismissed leader of the Nationalist Party in Romania. And the US have already attacked Romania for failing in its democratic duties. So you can see that this is going to definitely brighten the stars of the nationalist leaders. And for sure, the National Rally in France occupies a prominent position there. I mean, right behind the Italian coalition on the right, Fratelli d'Italia and the others.
Mikum, this swing to the right in Europe, in a sense, was triggered by the massive mistakes. Today, we know that perhaps, in a sense, they were mistakes because of the kind of turmoil they created in Europe, of the relentless and unceasing migration that were allowed by people like, in a sense, people like Macron, but also, infamously now by Angela Merkel and others. In Sweden, of course, the Swedish government and others. Now, there could have been a more structured approach to this migration, but there wasn't. I mean, there was a free for all for some time, and that really created a sort of atmosphere which became quite virulent in a sense about immigration, especially illegal immigration. Now that Syria, in a sense, has become a little more contained, the Bashar al-Assad government has fallen in Syria, there's a lot of talk that the EU especially would urge many Syrian immigrants to go back to Syria. Do you see that happening already? The EU has stopped, processing further applications of immigrants from Syria. Do you think there's going to be a sort of reverse migration, as it were? And if yes, in what pace might it catch?
I have my doubts about that. Number one, because Syria is becoming more and more dangerous and unruly, and a lot of people are being killed, tortured, and others are fleeing. So in this condition, for people who are supposed to be pro-Western to have come to Europe, to go back to Syria is a very dangerous proposition. And I think many of them are going to resist suggestions of leaving for Syria unless the situation really improves there and some law and order is restored. As you know, there is increasing talk of the breakup of Syria. There may be an independent state on the northwest on the Mediterranean coast because that's dominated by the Alawi community. Then there is the north, which is under Turkish influence, and that probably will gradually become autonomous, just like Iraqi Kurdistan has become autonomous. And then it seems that the Israelis would like to splinter Syria further and create a Druze state in the south next to their border. So all that means that Syria is in chaos, and I don't know who particularly would want to go back there unless they have some serious connections with the ruling movements there, which are basically Al-Qaeda under other names, So you may have some of the Islamists who are sort of now hunkering down in Europe, who may decide that after all, the pastures are greener now for them. But I think the so-called moderate pro-Western Syrians are very unlikely to feel like they should go back to their country. This is generally the situation. I think the only way that many immigrants might leave is if, on the one hand, the economic situation in Europe deteriorates to the point where they cannot even make a living, survive, and if, of course, repressive measures are taken to make their lives harder, in which case they might also decide that it's just not worth staying. Remember what Trump wants to do in America, which is canceled birthright to or citizenship if you are born in the US. Now, some European countries already have that you don't get citizenship simply because you are born in the country. And other countries, such as France, might reconsider that because Marine Le Pen, the National Rally, wants to cancel the birthright of nationality. That if you come to the country, even if you are born there, if your parents came, you are still not eligible for nationality unless you seriously show that you are integrated and you want to stay there and you have stable means of livelihood, right? So this is pretty much what we're looking at. And I think the current situation is not going to improve for quite a while, simply because the European leadership in general, which includes most of the European leaders, are committed to two things. which most people really don't feel good about. One is the EU, ever more federalism and ever more centralization of power within the EU in Brussels. And two, membership of NATO, which means you go to war with any country that the US designates as your enemy. And this has been the case in Ukraine, which is, of course, an unmitigated disaster because Europe has stuck itself in a position where they're supposed to fight forever for Ukraine without any real hope of victory and spending hundreds of billions on that, while the US is already changing course and Trump is saying, Ukraine is your baby. If you want to keep supporting it, do it. We are out. You'll have to pay for it, you know. And that, of course, is something which Europe cannot afford.
There are certain views today that, especially after the fall of Syria, which happened quite abruptly, literally overnight, within a week, the Syrian establishment of Bashar al-Assad failed and collapsed. Even though, there was a sense only a little while ago that, in a sense, Bashar al-Assad had won. He had managed to push back the rebels. He had managed to, contain Damascus. He had managed to hold on to power. And yet, within a week, everything collapsed. And Russia couldn't really come to, Bashar al-Assad's help. My apologies. But, a lot of people see this and wonder that, well, if Russia did not have the ability to support the Syrian establishment, is it really doing as well as people say it is in the Ukraine war? Could Ukraine also go the same way, with more, financial muscle from the West, more weapons from the West? Could Russia actually be weakening on the Ukrainian war? Or is it the reverse, that Russia did not want to focus anywhere else but on the Ukraine war because that's their primary goal? They've got Crimea back and they will hold on and they will, ensure that a part of Ukraine merges in a sense with Russia, and that'll be their great victory. Which one of these theories do you think is true?
Well, I think the last one is probably correct. I think most experts who are not blinded by EU blinkers and NATO blinkers realize that the Ukraine war is lost for Ukraine and for the West. Russia has won. It's not going to leave any of the territory it has taken, and it is adding new territory every day. If you look at what's happening now, there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who are moving back to the east because they prefer to be under Russian administration, because in Donbass, the essentials are supplied by the Russian government, whereas in Ukraine, people are beginning to starve. And they depend on payouts from the US and from supplies, electricity and food from Europe. So Ukraine is become now, to put it, bluntly, a beggar country. And therefore, not many people want to live under those conditions. Remember, many Ukrainians have been Russian for most of their lives, and they don't see why they should be with a losing country instead of being with a country which is still a superpower and which is now the fourth largest economy in the world, and therefore can, in a way, reclaim part of its former position as the Soviet Union with living conditions that are better than they were under the Soviet Union for the most part. So you see, clearly this is a victory. The Syrian case is very different. You see, there was an assessment for a long time that the Assad regime had been hollowed out. They had basically managed to not win the war, but sort of control the Islamist rebels, and they had pushed them into certain enclaves where they were by no means defeated. And so that very arrangement suggested that the Syrian army had not been able to win. And then all those people who had supposedly been defeated, what did you do with them? You would have had to kill all of them. You couldn't keep them in jail. There were hundreds of thousands. So you had to push them into Idlib and other enclaves and hope that they would stay there. Naturally, that could have been kept under some kind of control if the Syrian army had been strong enough, and if the Turks and the Israelis had not been supporting those terrorists. So from the moment that Assad saw that his army was basically starving, because remember, Syria has almost no revenues simply because the Americans have imposed a number of sanctions, and they have taken over the oil fields which they use for themselves. So as a result, Syria is not getting the oil revenues. Most of them are not coming through. And it had become, in a way, a country dependent on smuggling and drug trafficking. So this was not a viable situation. Assad is not a very, clever, ruthless statesman. He's an ophthalmologist who was put there by his family and his clan and his party because they didn't have anyone else. So he reluctantly accepted to be president, but I think he really resented and was very, very pained by what happened, by all the hundreds of thousands of Syrians who had been killed and had fled. And he was, in a way, a prisoner of his own system, which is the Alawi military Ba'ath party system that you know about. So as a result, when a new insurrection began, I think he assessed the situation, said, my army is not in a position to fight. Some soldiers are not even getting enough food. And there is a great scarcity of weapons. So what am I going to do? Start another civil war and gradually be surrounded and probably end up like Saddam Hussein. So the logical alternative was, no, Hezbollah cannot really help me because they are stuck in Lebanon with the Israelis. The Iranians are very worried about a new Israeli attack, and they are mostly concerned about protecting themselves. The Russians are focused on Ukraine, which they want to completely defeat before Trump's come to power. So that gives them another month or so. And so even the Russians said, listen, if your army is not in a position to fight, Russia cannot save your regime all by itself. Therefore, what was the alternative? Open negotiations with the rebels. Remember, there are like 45 different groups there, which don't agree among themselves. And so tell them, you will get power. Don't commit massacres because we are not going to fight you. So please save the lives of Syrian people as much as you can. We will leave you to power and see if you can handle it and if you can keep the country together. And then Assad left. And the Russians said, we're not going to be in Syria unless we make a deal with you, the new government, because we don't believe in being there against the government. So since the old government has fallen, we will have to make a deal with the new government. Otherwise, we cannot legally stay there. And the Iranians said, listen, you are in power, you are Israeli, so welcome and good luck. And if you want to work with us, we're ready to work with you, unless you want to become allies of Israel. In the meantime, of course, we know what happened. Israel took the opportunity to destroy every possible weapon that Syria had to make sure that Syria could never attack anybody again. So we'll see what happens now. But I think by and large, the strategic choice that the Russians made was sound. And from what I understand, there was an agreement. Agreements are not always kept, as we know, but between Russia, Turkey, and the leading groups in the current coalition that has taken over Syria, that Russia would keep its naval and military base in Hamain and Tartus, and that they would, in a way, protect the Alawis and make sure that the Alawis don't become another front to fight for the new Syrian government, dominated by the Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham. So that deal, if it works, would at least protect the basic interest of Russia and would, to some extent, protect the Alawis from persecution, because obviously they are hated by the Sunnis who came to power. Iran, of course, may have lost its its power in Syria, but then again, things can change quickly, you see. So in a way, everything right now is in suspense, and we'll have to see what happens. The West was jumping up and down and saying, what a great victory, Assad is gone, and now we have the wonderful Al-Qaeda groups in power. And of course, that may be the reason now, that may be the situation, but who knows what will happen in a month from now.
Last question then, Com. We have seen this pantomime before, isn't it, Com? We have seen this pantomime of so-called Al-Qaeda groups suddenly pretending to be, progressive and saying some of the right things. I mean, let's not forget, even the Taliban tried to say a few right things when when the Americans, leapt off roofs and got into their choppers and left Afghanistan only a few years ago. Even they came in trying to say a few things, that they will continue the Tolo TV station and this, that, and the other. And lo behold, only a few years later, they are very clear that not a single girl child will go to school, and all the tortures are back. So we have seen this pantomime before. How do you think this will go in or proceed in Syria?
You see, in politics, promises only commit those who believe in them. That's the first rule of the game. And second, there is no question that the Americans knew fairly well that the Taliban would not keep their promises, but they wanted to go, so they had to pretend that, yes, everything is done, we have got what we wanted, now we can go. The same thing happened in a way in Syria, that, Mr. Al-Julani is a terrorist, and we still have a $10 million,
On his head.
on his head, but we will talk to him, we'll invite him to speak on CNN, and we can maybe do business with him. In the end, whoever you can do business with becomes a good guy very quickly. So that is the way that the Americans are looking both at Syria and Afghanistan. And let's face it, Afghanistan kept at least part of the Taliban's promise. They basically do what they want at home, which the Americans couldn't care less about, frankly. They have never cared about human rights anywhere. But they are not so far disturbing anyone else. We don't know if that will change, but they are concentrating on their own affairs. And many people who have been to Afghanistan tell me that it's more peaceful now than it was in the last 20 years. So you can see that as you wish, but that's the way it is. Now, in Syria, according to Al-Jurani, the focus is on internal affairs, trying to somehow rescue the Syrian state. If he sticks to that agenda, then it may be an improvement for some of the neighbors and even for some of the superpowers. But of course, that is not a promise because, for example, they already say that they need to recover the Golan, which was annexed by Israel, and that they need to restore the Syrian territory. So does that mean they will soon try to attack Israel? We don't know. So all this is up in the air. But honestly, I think that Russia had no alternative but to try to negotiate quietly in the back with the new rulers and protect its own assets there, because trying to start a war with the winning guerrillas would have enmeshed Russia into another war when they are concentrating on, once and for all, defeating Ukraine.
We'll have to leave it at there, but really fascinating times, very disturbing times, of course, but also fascinating times. Of the most strange things, of course, we saw was the overnight, changing of the branding of Mr. Golani, as you say, from a dreaded terrorist with a $10 million bounty on his head to appearing on CNN with the same colored fatigues that, by the way, Zelensky wears in Ukraine. So I mean, this is a pantomime, and we'll see how this proceeds. But thank you once again for your time and very, very valuable, insightful insights as always, Combe, on the developing situation, of course, in Europe, which you know very well, but of course interconnected with the Middle East. Thanks very much, Come Carpentier de Gourdon. Thanks very much for your time.
Most welcome, Hindol. Thanks a lot. Always a pleasure.